green to others. I think
What do you mean?
if we needed to.
Hello, everyone. We're now recording. I'm sorry if some of you, well, nobody's here, so I'm sorry if you weren't able to make it live today, but as we've said, we are now recording this, so it will be available to rewatch later. I guess we just wanted to make sure that we got in nice and early. We were getting quite a few questions about Easter, and we're conscious that Easter starts Friday, it's Wednesday. We wanted to make sure you have the information you need before you go away for the weekend to feel confident and like you didn't have questions remaining, and give you plenty of time to rewatch this. So, yes.
Yeah, from henceforth, it will be Monday at 8:30 for the live Q&As. We will put a post up in the group probably on the Monday, just reminding you, but also seeking any questions that people might have. We've also previously in the group found that like often people will put questions in like their weekly reflection form. So we'll kind of pull some questions from there if we think it's going to be applicable to the whole group, which often they are.
Yes, but ultimately the more engaged you are, the better it's going to be for everyone. So if you can make it to the lives, please do, because it means that you can ask us questions live, which gives us a bit of a chat. In saying that, it is sometimes nice to have a little bit more time to prepare to answer particular questions.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind too. A nice balance is good, right? Like think of some questions before, but also if you're around to kind of give us feedback and ask follow-ups, that's a great scenario.
Yeah, it's always one of those situations where sometimes our answers will prompt further questions from you. And it's just easy if you're there to kind of like put that in there and get that answered straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to focus a bit on Easter because there are lots of questions that have come up. And I think the general kind of idea or question is like, how do you handle it being in a calorie deficit on a 40-42 plan? And I think what's important to acknowledge from the outset is that that's probably going to look different for everyone, and it should. We know that everyone here has a fat loss goal. I think everyone that's doing this program has a fat loss goal. Fat loss in itself requires some degree of restrictions. Hi, Steph. But restriction is subjective, right? So what I feel like is going to be restrictive, James might not. And a lot of that is going to depend on your values and your family life. So if you're someone for who Easter is a really big deal for your family, and maybe you love hot cross buns, you love chocolate, or maybe there's like a really staple sort of traditional family meal that you have where it's the same thing every year and you're really looking forward to that. Obviously, in that scenario, you're probably going to need a little bit more flexibility around this weekend to make it achievable for you. And, that is going to change how you approach it. For some people, if you're really into Easter or you have like a really indulgent kind of weekend planned, or a food environment that's largely outside of your control, this might look like more of a maintenance week. And I think that that's okay, and when I say maintenance week, sorry, I'm talking about in terms of like fat loss. Maybe we're not losing fat this week, maybe it is a maintenance week. And that is okay, because for a lot of people, it's events like this where actually that will kind of tip them into that black and white, all or nothing mentality where they go, well, screw it, I'm going to just go all in and really enjoy myself and eat all the chocolate. And on that, a good way to kind of think about progress over this weekend and times like this is, how would you have handled this weekend prior to doing this program, and using that as a sort of metric of success and progress, rather than something like, oh, well, I didn't eat any chocolate this Easter and that's the only way for me to succeed, or the only way I can have, a constructive or successful Easter is to stick to my plan 100%. If that makes sense.
Or scale weight.
Yeah.
And I guess that's another thing, like just expect at this time of year, if you do have a special meal, there's probably going to be a little bit more sodium, a little bit more carbs. So the scale is likely going to go up at some point, which isn't indicative necessarily of gaining body fat. So don't stress out about that. The best thing you can do is just return back to your normal routine as quickly as possible. I guess what I would say, kind of like just piggybacking off what Ash said in terms of like it being individualized at this, like in regards to how you approach it, is kind of because it's based upon values. And like even from a really I don't know what the word is, like objective sense with values. And like there's some kind of studies with this where you can literally put like monetary values on specific foods. And there are going to be specific things that I would pay more for than you would pay more for, and vice versa. And that's kind of like a, what am I thinking of? Like a word to describe this, like a very objective way of being able to view how you value certain foods. And so just understanding that and just being like, okay, well, did you talk about being a food snob?
Not yet.
I'll kind of steal
We're
it
still
from you.
listening.
Yeah. Yeah. So taking that and just being like, okay, understanding what are the things that you value more and what are the things that you don't really value. And then part of it is just being like, thinking of it almost like calories and dollars and going, you know, if I am going to eat something that is expensive in terms of calories, I want to make sure that it is something that I actually really love. And it's not just mindlessly consuming expensive things or expensive, like from a calorie perspective, if that makes sense.
I feel like a really good analogy for this is that I really like champagne. I would rather have 1 glass of Veuve Clicquot than 5 glasses of Prosecco. Do you know what I mean? So it's thinking like something you like, have some intentional, really mindfully enjoyed good quality stuff, as opposed to more of like the riff-raff stuff. You know what I mean? The average stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, like, that's just a general good rule of thumb to try and get into the habit of doing, is understanding what are the things that you really value and kind of focusing on them and not getting caught up in mindlessly eating stuff that you don't really enjoy. And that's so common, especially this kind of year and these kind of environments, because we know that like often there is just food around, especially if you are with family, you know, whether it's like a bowl of chips or some kind of platter or just a bowl of chocolates or something like that. And like, I know obviously like chocolate is rewarding, so like most people are going to like it. But even if you think about the types of chocolate, like it's going to be a little bit different. And maybe it's kind of having, like Ash said, fewer of some really good chocolates that you really, really love, that you're going to sit there and you're going to have one and you're going to like really savor it and enjoy, rather than just mindlessly smashing like, you know, the plain cheap chocolate eggs that aren't actually that great.
Yeah, so I feel like we've kind of set the foundation for generally things to keep in mind and, you know, the kind of context of this. I think it might be worth talking about, you know, as a Forge 42 participant, how we plan on tackling our weekend. Now, for context, my family, we're going to stay with my family down the coast. My family are not like us. They have different values to us. Health, I would say, not being one of them. So, you know, different kind of food environment and that sort of thing. And just on a funny note, my mum can't get her meat delivered there, so she got it delivered to our house. And it was like this massive porchetta that's like, I reckon like 60% fat, 40% meat, and these like lamb riblets that just have like this super thick layer of fat. They're going to be delicious, but like the saturated fat is high. And then, you know, we had a chat about what it's going to be like, and she's, you know, getting like chocolate and Easter buns and all the good stuff. So, you know, we're not exactly walking into a food environment that is conducive of fat loss goals. So how are we handling it? Well, firstly, you know, when we think about, I think we've spoken about how we kind of plan our meals with our one-on-one clients, but we have a meal planner that's like this, right? So these are like days of the week: breakfast, lunch, snacks, dinner. So what I started doing is sorry, James. I just like mapped out, I haven't on this, but on my plan, what the sort of like fixed meals are, right? So for us, that's going to be dinner on Friday and Saturday. So those are the things that I know for us are going to probably have the largest amount of calorie kind of allocation, right? And then so what I will be doing is trying to minimize calorie around that to give myself some wiggle room. What does that look like for me? I'm having a berry smoothie for breakfast with just protein powder, frozen berries, and probably water. For lunch, I'm going to be doing like probably a rotisserie chicken, like a barbecue chicken from the shops with like pre-bagged salad, just because it's easy to grab. For my snacks, I'm probably going to be doing like a YoPro packet, also because we'll be on the road for some of it. So it's something I can get from a servo, with like a melon cup that I'll probably pick up from Superbarn before we go. You could also obviously cut up your own fruit. So just to give you an idea of like some of the kind of lower calorie, higher volume, higher protein foods that you can go to that aren't going to require a huge amount of like time or prep or needing to get specific ingredients, because for a lot of us, we're going to be traveling, we're going to be on the road, we're going to be with family. It's not like a super supportive food environment where you can be like massively in control. So I would say like that's a big part of it. I've also like this weekend made the decision and made it clear to my family that I don't plan on drinking. So my mum's making margaritas. I love a mug. But, I said from the get-go, like, I don't really want to drink this weekend. Also, we're doing a big run on Saturday, so we've got some movement planned. But that kind of gives another good reason of like why I'm not drinking. And instead, we're doing like Sprite Zero with fresh mint and lime so that there's still something delicious to drink and we can be present and have a drink in my hand and be a part of that connection, which is a really important part of the weekend. But I have a plan. I've been clear about what's happening with that. And then as James touched on being a food snob, so I'm assuming there will be like probably eggs around. We're doing an Easter egg hunt for our 3-year-old son, Freddie. But I am also planning on getting some of the Tony chocolate-only little Easter eggs because they're really high-quality chocolate that I really enjoy. And so I know that I can have a few of those and I'll plan those in. We also talked about tracking. I think there was a comment about whether you should track. There are a few ways that you can go about this as well. So like you can estimate, you can like for the kind of food that I talked about, that's quite easy to track in Cronometer or whatever app you use. I'll probably be tracking and then like estimating what's for dinner. So just like, guessing to the best of my ability. I don't want to be there in the kitchen with my mum, like weighing everything necessarily. You can do that if you want. I just don't think it's going to be a reality for me. So I'll just be guessing different amounts. We also have within our Cronometer, if you're using that, an option where we could do fast tracking. So if you look up NNNF, no nonsense, nutrition fitness, meal out, there's a small, medium and large. So you can kind of allocate like what, the average kind of calorie count would be for various meals. Medium's probably a good bet. If you're having dessert or alcohol, it's probably going to be a large. So that's a way you can track it as well. Sorry, that was quite a lot of information.
It was, yeah.
I just wanted to explain how I'm planning on, I guess, navigating my Easter weekend being on the plan.
Yeah, I think Ash covered it pretty well there. I think just some of the main themes, just kind of summarize some of that, is we kind of call it like balancing the books, but essentially it's just balancing. There's going to be some energy dense meals coming up, identifying which of those meals are special to you, which are the ones that are locked in, and then trying to balance that by having some more nutrient dense but energy sparse type meals. When we think about that, you still want to try and keep volume reasonably high so that you're not ravenous. And so that could be basically you're looking at like a leaner protein source and either fruit or vegetables being like the primary thing. So like Ash mentioned, a smoothie. So she's getting a bunch of fruit in there. She's getting some protein in there, but it's still fairly low calorie. And that's also sticking fairly in line with what she does day to day, which makes things easier, makes it easier to track. She feels good on that, all of those kind of things. Then if you can, something like a salad is probably going to be a really good option for a lunchtime meal. You can make it really bulky. I think, we've got a couple of really decent salads in the recipe book as well. We have the turkey cranberry pumpkin one.
That's a really good one, yeah. The tuna and green bean one with potatoes, that's quite good as well.
The Big Mac salad, also awesome. Really solid.
Yeah.
So all of those are going to provide a really decent serve of food for a reasonably small amount of calories, which is kind of what we're looking for there. And then I guess one other thing that you could do, if it is a big meal, one thing that we want to do is we want to be mindful of calories, but you got to be careful that you don't restrict too much and then you go into these special events ravenous, because as hunger increases, your ability to be mindful starts to suffer. So if you go in and you're really hungry, it's going to be a lot harder for you to eat a reasonable amount and feel good with things. You're just going to find that you want to eat more and more. So something like we would call like a protein preload can be a really good idea. So if it's a dinner that you're going to, it could be just timing some form of like small protein snack prior to that. So like Ash mentioned, like a protein yogurt, or like fruit and veg is also a viable option here as well. It doesn't have to be protein. It's just a little bit more research in that area.
And it also, within that doesn't have to be like a perfectly chopped and prepared. Like we'll often grab like a carrot from the bag, like an apple from the fruit bowl. It can be like, not sophisticated or necessarily like super prepped.
Yeah. They can also be viable options. The other thing you can do if you want to make this really easy, I don't know if you wanted to touch on this. What was the third part? Yeah, we kind of can, but we kind of touched on it anyway. Is like ready meals can be a really good,
that's a great,
a really good, an easy option. Like if you don't have time to prepare, the way I look at this is like if you ever go into the supermarket and there's like some of them on sale, especially like some of the soups or some of the higher protein, lower calorie ones, probably worth grabbing and even just having them in the freezer. So you've got these emergency options that are already pre-portioned. They're high protein. They could be a little bit better on veg, but like it's still a viable option there.
That's also a good one to have because, like, say you get to a Friday and maybe you had planned on, I don't know, doing like loaded burger fries or something, but you're like, I'm actually so exhausted. The thought of prepping a meal does my head in. So instead of ordering a pizza or something like that, you've got a ready meal ready to go. And that's kind of like treating yourself by giving yourself the gift of convenience, while staying goal aligned.
Yeah. I guess the other thing, depending on like your situation, is having a think about like, is there any way that you can kind of influence the food environment in that given situation? So that just reminded me, like, let's say that it's you're catching up with all your family and they're just going to order pizzas. Can you either like take a big salad for everyone to share? Can you just buy some pre-made salads to kind of put in bowls and have on the table at the same time? Your family might think that's weird and they might be like, what is going on here? Like, we don't have salad. But at the same time, these are the kind of changes that can make a big difference, because if you're relying on something like pizza to fill you up, you're probably, going to be 4 or 5 slices deep. Whereas if you have a big side salad there, even if no one else is eating it, like you can fill up half your plate with kind of salad, have a couple of slices of pizza. It's reducing the energy density of the meal. It's getting more fiber, more nutrients in. And so you're going to feel fuller for less calories, essentially.
Or even just like having a quick check with your family or whoever's making the food. So like, this isn't going to be appropriate for everyone or every relationship. But for example, I called my mum and I was like, what are we having with these pork riblets? And she was like, I was thinking of steak sandwiches. And I was like, great, that's a good idea. There's another source of protein that's like a leaner protein. There's an option. You can kind of like modify that a little bit. So for example, I'll probably be having like an open face sandwich with like 1 piece of bread and lots of salad and a bit of steak and maybe 1 pork riblet. Whereas other people might have like 6 pork riblets and whatever. So kind of like having options where it's not necessarily going to like limit everyone else there, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility. Or like with the porchetta, she was like, I'm going to do roast potatoes. So I was like, awesome, let's do some roast pumpkin as well. Immediately gives me another kind of like starchy carb option that's giving me more volume for less calories. So just like things like that. Are there any small changes you can make to kind of, potentially give you a bit more flexibility to have lower calorie options where appropriate?
Yeah. Just bringing a big picture as well, like zooming right out. I think probably one of the biggest things in these situations that ends up causing people a lot more problems is just kind of falling into all or nothing and fuck it mindset. And like if you do anything else but avoid that, you're probably going to be winning, because that is kind of the natural path of like you go in with good intentions. Sometimes they're not realistic intentions, which is kind of like one of the first steps that we've talked about, is like having realistic intentions. Don't be like, I'm not going to eat any of these foods. Probably not going to happen. And as soon as it does happen, you feel like you've failed.
And I actually think Hannah made a really valuable comment in the community chat that she kind of said, and I'm paraphrasing here, sorry, Hannah, but like when she gives herself more flexibility and gives herself permission to enjoy those foods, she actually ends up eating less than if she tried to restrict and then ends up overdoing it. I think that's really insightful and important. We don't necessarily want you to like white knuckle it through and just try to not eat anything, indulgent or enjoyable over the weekend. Like that's probably not realistic. And like James is saying, it might even push you into that, like, well, now I've screwed it, I'm just going to keep going. And all of a sudden what could have been one indulgent meal becomes like 4 days of, overeating. So that's really important.
Yeah. So, and it's just kind of remembering, like, it's not the food in and of itself that usually causes the issue. It's your reaction or response to eating it. So, like, if you see having a hot cross bun or having some chocolate as bad or breaking the rules or whatever it might be, that is going to cause some kind of further on effect where you then are like, well, fuck it, I've fucked up. I might as well eat all of it. Like Ash said, basically, what could have been you maybe just go to maintenance calories for that day does push you into a large surplus, and you do kind of, see a little bit of kind of body fat gain there. But again, big picture, 1 day, even 3 days, even 4 days, not the end of the world. Like, it's kind of just being able to say, it's like, okay, and again, this comes back to self-compassion. It comes back to cognitive flexibility and that ability to kind of just be like, I am human. This happens sometimes. If things don't go quite to plan, ideally we try and be curious with that, and we go, okay, well, why did this happen? What could I have potentially done differently? But then we move on and we go, cool, back into normal routine. Let's focus on what is within our control and move forward.
I actually just want to expand on that self-compassion here, because I feel like that's a really important part of this weekend, because there's a lot going on, right, for a lot of us. So, like, I'm just going to use myself again as an example. We've got travel, with Freddie. So who knows, maybe he'll wake up on the wrong side of the bed. The drive might be a bit exhausting. We could get there and my dad will say something dumb that annoys me. Like, there's a lot of factors here that could kind of like trigger an emotional or tired state, right? And so I think it's really important to practice compassion, because say I get to Friday night and all of those things have happened, maybe I'll have a mug, maybe I'll have a couple of extra Easter eggs, like, and acknowledging what's going on for you. Like, well, today was really hard and I'm tired and emotional. And it's not about like finding excuses or anything like that. It's just about acknowledging objectively what is happening for you, allowing yourself to be human, forgiving yourself if you do end up overeating a bit. The other thing to remember is, like, for a lot of you, like, this might be new, what we're talking about. And we know that when you're trying to adopt new habits and new ways of thinking, like, inevitably there will be times where it doesn't happen. And that's okay. Like, forgiving yourself and moving on. That is what facilitates moving away from that all or nothing thinking into a more flexible mindset that makes this sustainable over the long term. Because yes, we absolutely want you to have success over these 6 weeks, right? But this is about more than that. It's kind of like setting the foundation for potentially what a healthy lifestyle looks for you in this season of your life and beyond. So I think that that's important to think about as well.
Yeah. Okay, we'll wrap up shortly. Just a few final things, maybe, unless you had a lot more to offer. I know that part of the question that we talked about was kind of like about calorie tracking and should you do it. I think it's kind of up to you. The main thing is about awareness of calories. So just being aware of what is the more energy dense foods and what isn't, and then just kind of trying to balance those things across the weekend. There's nothing wrong with tracking 3/4 of your day, and then, like, if dinner feels too much, not tracking that and then just getting back into it. Don't feel like you've messed up if that's the case. You can absolutely not track those days if you want, but still being aware of it, or you can try and track all of it. That's up to you. One thing I would say is, don't get like caught up or be super anal about trying to balance the books. So if you go over by a couple of 100 calories or 1,000 calories, don't try and cut back by the exact same amount the next day. If you feel up to having a slightly lighter day the next day, absolutely fine. But we don't want to start getting into that habit of like overeating, undereating, because then we start getting into a binge restrict type cycle, which we don't want to do. The best thing you can do is just get back into your normal routine and kind of continue to build those habits with that. The final thing that I thought of was